All right, welcome to the afternoon of Words and Music Day 1. Thank you guys so much for being here. So excited to have you all in this beautiful space at the Jazz Market. Give it up for the Jazz Market staff. We don't give them up enough. And also, we do have a bartender on site now. So if you are the day drinking type, if you like booze with your literature, I am sure they will be happy to serve you. So Words and Music always has a bent on social justice, and we just heard an amazing panel on the sentences that create us. We're continuing that sort of conversation now with comics, zines, and social justice. Basically, how are we using art and images to speak to larger issues about justice and who gets to decide what justice looks like? So I'm going to turn it over to our MC, Nick Weldon, who will then introduce the rest of these guys. Nick is with our sponsor for this session, the Historic New Orleans Collection. He's one of the editors. And one of the things that Nick has edited most recently is a book called Monumental, which tells the story of the first Black lieutenant governor of Louisiana in graphic novel form. My kid read it when he was 8 and did not realize he was learning history. That's how good this book is. He thought it was a comic book. He thought it was fiction. He was so engaged. And then I said, everything is true. And his mind was blown. So y'all pick up a copy of Monumental if you haven't had the chance. Also, I'm really excited to tell you that we will probably be able, if current permissions hold, to get this book into the Orleans Parish Jail very, very soon. So look forward to Monumental reaching even more folks who would have been missing out on this book. And with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Nick.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks. Now, can you guys hear me? I want to be able to see the panel, so I'm kind of like shifted out this way. But she did a lot of the introducing for me. But hi, I'm Nick. Like she said, I'm an editor of the Historic New Orleans Collection. You see our logo over there. I just want to say the Historic New Orleans Collection is really appreciative and proud to support the work that One Book, One New Orleans, Community Book Center, and our other collaborators do so well in the community to encourage our neighbors in New Orleans to support local authors and publishers. We also encourage people to visit our Williams Research Center at 410 Charter Street as a starting point for exploring the history of the city as you conceptualize new creative works like everybody up here does. This is a really cool topic today. It's comics, zines, and social justice, and we have a really good panel. It's kind of funny that this is happening today. Yesterday, my son, who's in first grade, his school hosted a first graders march around their campus building, and the kids have been working on signs for different social causes that are important to them. And he wouldn't tell me what his topic was. It turned out it was about not harming animals, and he had a really cool sign he was proud to hold of animals. It said, "Don't harm animals." But, you know, it's just this parade of first graders, Black Lives Matter, justice, our future, all this stuff, and then, 7-year-old kids. And it just kind of filled my heart. It's signs, it's words, it's images, it's messages, and that's kind of what everybody up here specializes in. Using those forms to convey passion, about subjects they really care about. So, without further ado, I want to start. This is Hrilina, and Hrilina is a founding member of Trinity City Comics, which she's going to tell you a little bit more about in a minute. Next to her is Chelsey K. Shannon, who is the author of Trace Chasing, Race, Place, Time, and Emmett Till, and she's also an editor at UNO Press. And then down at the end, we have Ceasar Meadows. He's Antigravity's comics editor, and he's a current member of Antenna's Artist Collective. So to start out, panelists, hope you all can see me. I thought maybe we could just go down the line. I know we're a little bit limited for time, and I want to make sure we have some good conversation, but just maybe start by, you can introduce yourselves and just say a little bit about the work that's brought you to this panel today. And Hrilina, you want to get us started?
Yes. Hello, my name is Hrilina. Like Nick said, I am a teen advisor and founding member of the Audience Feedback Committee for Trinity City Comics. So I've been fortunate to see the development of Trinity City from very early on. I was contacted through an organization that I've been part of And it was me and 2 other teens from the organization. So we've kind of been on Zoom meetings and in-person meetings and just getting a sense of the behind-the-scenes aspect of what goes into making a comic.
And so Trinity City, right, is, as I understand it, it's going to be a series of like Afro-Futurist graphic novels set in the city of New Orleans in 2078. And it's this big collaborative effort between some of y'all younger folks, some older established artists and writers, and you're working on the first of 4 graphic novels right now, right?
And just to add, the characters of the comic are based off of the 3 teens, not the ones that we were part of, but the 3 teens that were sharing their own stories for the comics and creating stories.
Right, so it's a work of fiction, but it's steeped in people's lived experiences here in New Orleans today. Yeah. Chelsey, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Chelsey. Yeah, the piece that brought me to the panel today is Trace Chasing, as you said, which is a zine I self-published this year, but wrote back in 2018 after a road trip I took from Cincinnati through the Mississippi Delta back here home to New Orleans. And I visited several sites that were relevant in the life and death of Emmett Till, and was profoundly moved by that journey, including 2 museums that I visited in that area. And basically, when I came home, I was like brimming in a way that I hadn't ever quite felt before, and felt like I had traveled through not just space, but time and bodies of grief and like just so much. So I basically sat down and wrote the text of the zine in like 2 days, and then it sat on my computer for 4 years because I wasn't quite sure what to do with it from there. And I was writing from within like the tenderloin of the Trump years, so it also folds in a lot of my anger and alienation from existing in this country during that time. And eventually I decided to exhume it and get it made up. I printed it at paper machine. And that's basically where, I don't know, that's where it is now. It exists, it's in the world, and I'm still trying to figure out how to relate to it now that it is in the world. So it feels good to be here to talk about it in public with other people. But in general, I think zines are a really liberating way to talk about some of the deepest truths that we have, and maybe some of the hardest aspects of life and collective experiences. And for me, I think it's a way to move away from the perfectionism and the kind of product orientation that traditional publishing can entail. And just be focused on transmitting this transmitting the truth that you're trying to get across. And in January, I'll be co-teaching a course on zines and self-publishing with Avery Mittelstein. So I'm excited to kind of turn away from just delving into my personal well, and then turn that ability to make these stories through self-publishing and share that with other people too.
Will that be at UNO?
Yes, it is through UNO, and it will be held at Paper Machine.
Awesome, awesome. That's really cool. Ceasar, you want to tell us about yourself?
Yes, I'll try to make this, concise. New Orleans native, grew up here in New Orleans, wanted to be a cartoonist when I was younger, and grew up to actually, in the 90s, to start self-publishing, which was a sort of trend coming out of the 80s, zine making and comics making here. So, into the course of publishing in the 90s, self-publishing, and also doing collaborative comics with other artists. That was also something where I learned the value of the conversations that happen when you start collaborating, making comics together. And then that led to where you have magazine started publishing my comics monthly, which eventually, because that was out there, Antigravity magazine was also starting to publish comics, and I got my comics in there, and eventually, I guess because of doing it long enough, I sort of became the comics editor that was sort of overseeing the submissions that were sent into. But I guess the thing about zines and comics, it was, I guess, the accessibility of them, being that you didn't need a lot of money, you just needed a pen, paper, computer or something, but it just had to be your passion of that particular subject. And it could be a lot more immediate to whatever the time was, because you weren't making lots of them, you were making just enough at the time. And you could it was very personal and intimate, and that's what I loved about the kind of comics that I was doing. The ones that I started self-publishing, I also liked the fact that it wasn't a typical book. It could be lots of different formats, and I specialize in doing really tiny comic books that I put in different types of paper packages that I thought was really neat, that made it special. It gave it when I was a kid, I loved comics so much. When I would put my comics in these little found objects, like make little pyramids or little robots or something, I liked having the joy that people would feel when they discovered my comics would relate to the same joy I felt when I was a kid. And I guess going back to now, I've been involved with the Antenna Collective, which started off as Press Street, and a big, going back right after Katrina, there was something that started called the 24-hour Draw-Thon, which I was one of the first volunteers, organizers, as part of that. I guess we'll be having our 17th one coming up in December. But that was where I definitely learned that taking the working together, drawing together and stuff really gets people conversing and discussing things. But I think the foundation of social justice is having people actually get into conversations and discussing and building community. And I think that's the thing that I think is most amazing about comics, is that it does build community. And all the work that I've done in New Orleans with comics has built a comics community that I feel like does have sort of a sense of community that I think helps to debate and discuss issues like social justice.
You said something interesting there about the accessibility from the perspective of the creator, because when I thought about, like, when we were making Monumental, and just in terms of visual storytelling, it's accessible for the reader, the audience, because people learn different ways, words, images, different permutations of all of that. But you're talking about just being able to, depending on how you're publishing it or putting it out into the world, the accessibility and maybe the broadened tool set, all of these different formats used, whether it's comics or, you all are creating a graphic novel or zines, although your zine is more like a short book, like you told me. It's a, so maybe y'all can talk a little bit about how your specific format, what kind of audiences you want to reach and how it maybe, the specific nature of what you're creating might help reach, different people. So we don't have to go right down the line if anybody wants to jump in. I'm curious about zines and maybe how you compare this to like maybe a more tabloid type of zine. Like maybe you can talk about the non-traditional nature of it and what that allows you to do as a creator.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I kind of approached this document, this zine, as a sort of travel log, but one that is intensely personal and very emotional, and also like very fluid in terms of where and when it's taking place. So the timeline like oscillates a lot, and like even though my road trip was linear, driving, I was able to kind of replicate where my mind was going as I moved through the history and the different places, different things were evoked, and also different texts. And I guess I felt that, especially dealing with race and white supremacy and dealing with my own racial identity as I moved through these histories, like just the idea of like trying to conform that to a conventional publication would have been a whole other layer of trauma, frankly. So to just have this as my own publication, my own zine, and have myself almost as my first audience and have that be a valid premise enabled me to write the thing at all. Yeah.
But not only have yourself as your own audience, I want to just stick on this for a minute, because what you did is you said, you dusted it off 4 years later, and then you went back and you footnoted yourself and you left it all in there. Why did you do that?
I did that because I'm like, okay, now it is not just for me. It's been like curing, I guess, and now I am ready to move it out into the world. And my views on everything that I've discussed in here, including my regard of this history and of region and of identity and all of that, have changed in the last 4 years. And I wanted to own that. I wanted to put it into the text rather than just cleaning it up and making it more palatable or, more acceptable, I guess. And I wanted to show the ways in which I'd grown and claim the mistakes that I now perceive that I'd made, or, not even mistakes, just I don't know, just misapprehensions, I guess, the learning that was still there to happen. So to me, that added another layer of like temporality to put that in there, and some more vulnerability as well.
So speaking of audience, maybe you can talk a little bit about who you want to reach with Trinity City, and then Ceasar Antigravity is a different thing entirely. What, who we're trying to reach with these, visual mediums.
Trinity City is like by teens, for teens. There are 3 teens that are part of the creative process, and then 3 that are part of the audience feedback process. And just when I get to see it at all of its developmental stages, I see myself as the audience as like, okay, this is like a New Orleans, like a story about New Orleans teens, and I see my friends. I'm like, okay, I already started the process with my friends, being part of this, like people that I've seen every couple months. So I knew them, and we would get on calls together and discuss it a bit. And then I would read it, and I was like, okay, I can definitely picture my classmate like taking it to them and being like, you would really like this. So there's that, and it's teen protagonists definitely like resonate with me. So I'm always like really pumped when I like open a book or I press play on something and like I see a teen slaying. Like I think I'm like, okay, this is for me. This is something that I'm really gonna dive into, and it's gonna actually like affect change in me. Plus, no one will represent.
So I'm curious, working with older creators, especially like really established people like Steve Prince. What kind of feedback have you given to them, or have you, like from a teen's or a young person's perspective? Have there been any points where like, well, could you do a little bit more of this or a little bit less of that? Or I wonder if you've helped them along the way at all.
That's a really good question. From like our process, what I remember is like my very first meeting, getting on a Zoom call with Mr. And him getting like asking us questions about our opinions, like our thoughts on certain like political I don't know, happenings, how we felt about it, and then going off of that and like creating like a compilation of like our answers and things like that. So I would say it was like preemptive, like they already knew what our opinions were when we were going into it, and we had some times where we would like discuss what maybe we would want to see in a comic, and then we would get it, and then I think it clicked for all of us. Like I can't exactly pinpoint a place where I'm like, that's my influence, because I think we just have our influence scattered throughout. So I don't think it's like, I know you're like super amazing and talented, but you know, it changes. Right. It's like they had already gotten like a sense of who we were and gotten to know us before they, as far as I know, started the process. Yeah. So then it seems like they were already taking us into consideration before they'd even set pen to paper.
That's great. I mean, that's if it's going to be a collaborative process like that, get as much information as you can on the front end before you tell an illustrator to redraw pages. Not that I'm speaking from experience. Ceasar, maybe you can tell us a little bit about audience. I mean, do teenagers factor into Antigravity?
I mean, well, I think the actual magazine itself, I think, is a really unique one in New Orleans, in that it's called Antigravity because it's sort of an anti-typical New Orleans magazine where it's not trying to focus on the more traditional things that we think about New Orleans. It's really trying to treat it as more like there's culture going on here that you would maybe didn't realize was going on. And as far as so a lot of their articles are about social justice issues. And it started off as a magazine that was covering music and more pop culture things. But as it went along, and actually the original founder basically sold it to this gentleman, Dan Fox, who's now the editor-publisher. And with him, he had actually been influenced by an early zine that was done called Dialogue by someone named Brad Ott, who had self-published in the 80s, that was really really social justice. I mean, it was pretty amazing, and it was done like with no budget at all and stuff. But Dan, when he was a teenager, I remember reading issues of that and feeling really inspired. So when he took over Antigravity, he really wanted to reflect that it was important to have a free monthly magazine here. And as far as the comics, he wanted, there was comics in it, but he also wanted to diversify the amount of comics in there, which, as comics editor, there is a really great political cartoonist is in there, Keith Knight, and his strip, The K Chronicles, and he also had another strip called Think, or TH Inc., and that's a really great one. And he also has a series on Hulu called Woke, which is about sort of semi-autobiographical and all these, I guess, cartoon, these items come alive, with sort of, he just kind of talks to cartoon items come alive and stuff. But, so that's always been a mainstay, that comic's been in Antigravity. But as far as the comics that I'm editing over, they haven't been so much political as non-traditional. There are some I'm pretty traditional in the strip that I do, but allowing people that maybe haven't worked, like doing just like gag strips, which we've actually had some women cartoonists who aren't really doing a traditional gag strip, but what they're doing monthly is something really interesting. It's taking that single panel and doing some concept or some idea that's but normally maybe wouldn't fly in a more traditional medium where you wanted to have a gag. It was more like a really great idea is being shown, and a great illustration is accompanying it. So, which I feel proud to have been the person looking for this, and hopefully when you get more submissions from people and Dan is willing to give space for these artists and these comic artists who necessarily wouldn't maybe have other places they could publish their work. But as far as I don't think it's geared to a particular artist. I think it's geared to anyone who wants to pick up something and read something that's going to inform them about real issues and real goings on that they can actually actively become a part of here in New Orleans in a way that maybe is very accessible and informs them I've learned quite a bit, as from articles in the magazine. Even though I'm part of the magazine, there's tons of stuff I've learned from just reading it month to month.
And credit to you, because you assemble such a unique kind of collective of voices. So you get different styles of comics, but together they kind of create this thing that's larger than just any single strip.
Which is a thing, as someone who I said loved comics in the 70s and have kind of seen the changes since then, where it was really, there wasn't the kind of diversity. It wasn't until the 80s where you started to see more diversity in terms of the types of comics. It was really superhero stuff or cute sort of funny animal stuff that was more child-oriented. But then you started to have works that were more literary and ambition and more autobiographical, people talking about their lives and also talking about issues that were important to them. And then I think because there was a generation during that, there was a new generation of readers who grew up reading those comics, and because they hadn't read the superhero stuff, they wanted to emulate the stuff that was, and also it seemed more accessible. The other stuff seemed like you had to have years of practice to get really good. The ones that seemed to be were more, you could see yourself getting well enough to draw, because that's the thing, you can draw really well, but if your story is not very compelling, it's not really going to be very comic. Whereas you could have a really great writing and the graphics may not be up to par, but it's still more compelling. I think it's more compelling to have really great writing than it has really great art. And I think that's the thing that's really driven lots of people to try it, where it seems like I could do that. It's like it doesn't seem that far away, and because of that, a lot more people with different backgrounds, different stories, different histories have started to put their stories in. And then it sort of feeds itself to where when you go look, I can't keep up with all of it, but there's so much stuff being published now that I think is great for any young person growing up. And also the bias of there was a time where you graduate from words and pictures and you're strictly reading prose or poetry, that's sort of going away. It's like realizing that it's not unsophisticated, it's its own medium in which you learn how to do it really well to balance those words and pictures in such a way. And so I think that's great that that's still there. That's still adding to increasing the audience because there's more, you can go and take your pick of these different things. You can sample more. And that's what I think is amazing to have seen how limited it was then to where we are today, to see this new work coming along that, you pick it up and you're really enriched by seeing this perspective from someone that you had no idea about until you read it.
And there's such a contrast between what you're able to do or what one of these comic artists are able to do in either a single panel or, a limited amount of space versus a zine, where you kind of have free form to write to the length that feels right, or something like this book, which has 180 pages of illustrations. I have a really great appreciation for artists and writers, poets, who can get to the point. And so I wonder, just to stick on this for a second, and we'll expand to kind of talk about just the limitations and advantages of format. How do you achieve that direct, that brevity, in a message, because you are a comic creator yourself, so I'm kind of curious about your process when you're trying to make a point or an observation in as concise a fashion as possible.
Well, I usually start, backwards when I'm doing a strip. I usually think of an idea that I know that's great, and I'm usually thinking, once I have sort of the ending of that strip, or how I'm thinking, how can I then build to that ending, as opposed to starting and hoping you come up with it. Because if you start with, you can just find yourself just kind of fumbling and stuff. So I find it's a lot easier if you suddenly get a great idea that you want to communicate, and then you can work backwards. And one of the reasons, I personally, once I have that ending, I guess you could say, I'm someone who loves the tradition of comics being the language itself. It's where you can kind of get away with more alliteration, more silly words, more, this is medium I like. I tend to, it's just my personal philosophy and stuff. Life to me at times can seem quite absurd, and most of my comics are usually two characters having some inane discussion. And sometimes it can be very serious what they're talking about, other times it's very light. But I find that constructing the dialogue between those characters, once I know the ending, is part of the fun of doing it. But also realizing, generally, you have, with a strip, you have so many panels to work within. So with a graphic novel, you've got this big open-ended to where it may be hard to edit down. And as for me, like I said, I've done little comics that are in little capsule machines. And part of me is just always thought of, I'm trying to construct something that's kind of transitory, but has the joy of puffing a dandelion. It's like, you're going to read this little thing, this little story, and hopefully it's going to make you smile or laugh. And that's, and if I do a really great, and also I've constructed most of mine to where they're not super topical. I try to structure them to where the humor comes from the situation that can be sort of timeless, or at least if it's something that's too topical, I feel like it'll seem dated, because I've been doing this for a while. So a lot of the ones that I've done, I feel you could read today, and it's still, because it's still just, the humor is still timeless, because it's about relationships between characters as opposed to specific things. And that's just me, how I like to structure my particular comics. I realize the thing about the immediacy of zines being able that you can do something that's really topical and stuff, which again, that's a bit of a different, using that to structure what you're trying to tell, but I do think there's that same immediacy of connection that you're trying to get from that smaller format. And that's what I think is really great about working within that smaller format. I think it forces you to kind of have to get rid of the stuff that's really not working and stuff, And I would also say deadline is probably the biggest thing. So that's the one thing I would say any young artist, if there's, and I feel very fortunate to have had a deadline in a monthly periodical, is there's less and less of those, is that's really what gets your editing down, is that you have to have it ready, sent to be published at this time. So whatever idea you're thinking and playing with, you've got to be able to put it down and go with it. And I feel like that's part of the process of an artist, is having something where you have to enter an idea and run with it at some point. And a lot of times, if you don't have a deadline or an ending, you can just kind of keep, which is not necessarily bad, but I do know it can leave you kind of fumbling in this sort of space, like how do you wrap things up?
I mean, Chelsey, you're you've worn both hats. A lot of us have worn, you've been the creator and then you've been the editor, and so you've had to be the person, pushing people on deadline. But I'm curious, when you're not wearing an editor hat, what is your creative process like? You have an idea, now what?
Now I fret about it for a long time, and then I outline, and then it keeps growing, and it keeps growing, and the outline expands, and then I wonder how I'm ever going to do it, and then I have an emotional episode, and then I'm like, you know what, I can do this, and I sit down and schedule time and work at it in chunks, and then it starts improving, and then I take a break, and then eventually find my way back. That's kind of how it's gone. So yeah, this project was atypical, I think, because it was really visceral, and it all just felt so there, and I was like bursting to say what I needed to say here. But in general, I'm much more like methodical and structural, and it takes a lot more time. And also in terms of brevity, I really wasn't concerned with that with this project, but something, I guess, a counterweight of that was when I did get this printed, or when I got it, printed just in the library, not like printed. I'm like, okay, I'm going to bind these myself. I'm going to print the cover and like sew them to bind them. And that would have been absolutely impossible. It's too thick. I was like, however many, I forget the term for like the sections of a book, but each one took like so much hand strength to get the needle through. I'm like, okay, this isn't gonna work. So maybe with some more brevity, but I think it's a before I wanted to be.
I've asked you a lot about the making of, but I wonder if maybe you can share a little bit more about the actual subject matter of the story and why it is so personal to you. And I mean, obviously it came out into this beautiful thing, and I read your excerpt, and it's fantastic. It's effective. You can just tell us about this story.
Sure. Yeah, the story is basically, I guess as a preface, I moved to New Orleans in 2014, and that same year I had ear surgery in Ohio, which is where I'm from, Cincinnati, and I had several follow-up appointments in Cincinnati, and I wasn't able to fly, so I had to do a lot of road trips back to Cincinnati to see that doctor. So I made a lot of the 12-hour drives between here and Cincinnati. And during those drives, I thought, they were just an excellent window of time to sort of digest my new life and to think about region and to watch the land change and all of that and think about culture and etc. So those drives were kind of the preface to this drive, which was later. And I don't know. So both my parents passed when I was young, so that was some text of coming home to Cincinnati, and I was actually picking up stuff from one of my aunt's house, like from my parents' house to bring it back here. So this idea of like home shifting and what is homecoming or what is home going was very heavy on my mind. And I decided to pass through Mississippi because I had read maybe Till Mobley's memoir that same spring. And I was like, well, you know, I'm already on the road. This is easy to fold in, and I really want to place this history and like place this trauma and place, you know, this story of American history. So I decided to, you know, make that drive on the way back to New Orleans. So I guess part of the impetus was to leave something of my childhood in this place where Emmett had suffered and to kind of yoke those two memories, this collective memory and my personal memory, this collective grief and my personal grief. So it's really just the story of that drive and how, you know, mine and my family's grief of losing my father in particular, and maybe Till Mobley and Emmett's family's grief and losing their child, how those things are similar and different, and what it means to grieve somebody who is Black and what it means to lose somebody who goes on a trip that they never come back from, which was the case with my father and with Emmett. And with the Till family, they had moved to Chicago from Mississippi in the same way that my dad's side had moved from the South to Ohio in the Great Migration. So yeah, it was really all just about migrations of many kinds, like literal, metaphysical, temporary, permanent, all of that. Yeah, it became, that drive became a crucible for all those kinds of thoughts.
Yeah, and you said the word home, and in the text you capitalize it, and it is not just the place you are. I mean, I'm not going to explain the way you wrote it because you did it much more elegantly, but home is something that plays into all of these stories, ways of storytelling, the place where your heart is, what you're passionate about. And so at Trinity City Comics, this is visualizing a home 50 years in the future. And you mentioned the process of, you know, the issues that matter to you and how you want to see yourselves depicted in this kind of graphic novel. So how do you picture the home, you know, New Orleans in 50 years, and what are the issues that you want Trinity City to talk about?
I'm taking it all in. I really like this question because I'm like very into environmental activism, and I've written poems about it and stuff like that. So like a couple years ago, I had gotten really moved, but I gotten really moved that we were losing like football fields worth of land. So I really hope, you know, there's big and small things that we can do. Obviously, people all know about like reducing single plastic waste and things like that. There's like, and I think there's political activism and environmental activism. I think they kind of go hand in hand. But I just think because of like New Orleans in itself, like just seeing so much of it get deteriorated, and so I really hope that doesn't happen. And I think it's funny because when I read like futuristic stories and I'm like, I really do hope that we have a world that has a future. Like some people are like, oh, this isn't possible because of this or this. I'm like, oh, it's not possible because we might not have this planet. What's the second part of the question?
Oh, I mean, you're kind of covering it. I mean, so with all of those concerns and anxieties in mind, I know, you know, from what I've heard about this book from some of the creators that you've worked with, is it's not meant to be post-apocalyptic entirely or gloom and doom entirely. It's predicting an adaptive environment, right? We're seeing some slides from Trinity City over here. I don't know if anybody's in control of that, but what is the New Orleans that this story is depicting? What are some of the, I mean, I've heard some details like so the city's mostly underwater, right? There's lily pad colonies that people live on. I'm curious if you know like some of the details that are depicting this adaptation that's taking place.
So something that I really like, and this kind of connects in with the discussions that we were having before we even saw any part of the product, was that we were asked maybe like what we would want to see in the story, or like how we would do it, and the three of us just brainstormed and talked, and we were like, oh, we're thinking like, well, it's futuristic, maybe like this whole system has changed, like it's, inviting everyone to be a part of it instead of just like a select group. And then like things had happened, and we read it, and I was so pleased with the story, and like, we were listened to, but I was like, what we were coming up with was a whole different thing. Like, in our perfect world, this is what we can come up with. What I liked about Trinity City is that it meets the reader where we're at right now, with its things that are happening right now in a futuristic environment, but it's something that you can relate to right now, and I think that's really moving, because when you read it, especially as a teenager, especially as a New Orleanian, like all the demographics that overlap, I get moved. I'm like, okay, now I see, like, this is what we can do with our voice now, even though the characters are like way in the future.
Yeah, and I'm saying up here, I mean, there's an aspect to this too where you all are planning to spin this out into workshops,
yes,
right? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that is. I mean, because this is kind of an expansion of kind of what this panel is all about, right?
Right. That's something else that I really like. It's taking seriously the audience, because and I wrote this, and it's kind of answering your question.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I am like obsessed with the decision that they made. They made a specific choice to have the illustrations in black and white, leaving the coloring up to the reader. What I liked about that, and I'm going to read because it's very important. I'm like always inspired by the people and the characters I see and look up to, and I pick up on their hobbies and their mannerisms and their sense of style. Like yesterday, I was like, oh, I'm gonna dress up like my favorite character. I'm gonna act like her and talk like her. But from my perspective, seeing a character that I see myself in, or I personally relate to, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna adopt some of their characteristics. What I really liked about this is that the reader gets to add their own characteristics to the characters that they're reading on. So it's something I don't know, like such as changing the color palette, or having that like decision for you to make. You're allowing your voice to the story, and you can like see yourself, or you can see your friends and family and like the world. You're part of the world building that they're doing, and then it's like a way for you to make it entirely your own. So as a reader, I see the pictures, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna add my voice to the story, and I'm being heard, and I have my own influence, and it translates to being in real life, having my own voice and influence on things that I want to see. So that's a part of it. And then there's the workshops. So already we're part of, we see it, and we talk about things, and then we come back and there's this. But the fact that there's workshops that even after the issue has come out, it's not, what I really like about this is it's not like preachy, and it's not pandering or like patronizing. I like alliteration. What I like about it is that it's a conversation. It's a conversation starter, and that goes back to, we were thinking about perfect world, and then meeting the audience where we're at now. It's really effective because everyone has their story, and that's like part of the mission, is that everyone, no matter what, has a voice to bring to the table. So then actually like affecting that, having that like in-person discussion, it's like we've all read it, and we know, I don't think as of right now, there's anything perfect you can say. You can't be like, we're gonna do this, this, and this, and that's gonna solve all of the problems. So I have all these panels and discussions, but it's taking into account voices, and not just voices, but like teens' voices, like the future's voice, for what they want to see. And then I heard that we're gonna, like, after we have those workshops and listen and take feedback and everything, they're gonna like adapt to the story from everything. So like I say, I'm a founding member of the audience feedback committee. I'm not, the three of us aren't gonna be the only ones. Like a bunch of teens from all over are gonna have their voice heard. And then there are four, like you said, 4 issues. So it's gonna continue on. And
kind of an adaptive story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Kind of thinking about conversations and reacting to content. I mean, Chelsey and Ceasar, as editors, I was curious, I don't know your process at Antigravity. Are you more of a curator of comics, or do you ever have dialogue with artists to kind of help them suss out their message or their art?
No, I'm pretty much like, they'll send their work to me, and and I'll give them feedback or something, and because a lot of times, especially if someone submitted something, or if I meet somebody for the course and I say, hey, have you ever thought about doing, like a quarter-page strip or like a monthly, and if they haven't, it's like, would you want to try it, or at least, and because it is kind of difficult if you haven't worked, just try to condense it, even if you're not going to do a gag, but you're going to use that quarter-page space to do something that is a point, or, but as far as the ultimate, like, so then I'll get all that, prep it for the magazine so it's good to go, and then I'll send that in to the editorial team that does it. And ultimately, I mean, they're looking for something that, I mean, a lot of times there's slots that are there to put stuff in. And I usually say it's not like you need to just do the one, you can put several, because you like some more options, like since it is a monthly. You can try different ideas, and if there's one that kind of like reflects on something that is going on now, I mean, I know Dan would want to run that stuff, he's not so much something preachy, but just something that has an element of something that's reflecting something going on in the community. But it's really up to the, I'm not saying, hey, you should do this. It's like, it's pretty much, if I meet someone and think, hey, and a lot of times I also have to feel artists sending stuff in that they're not quite there yet, or I feel like it's just, you need to, and that's hard to sometimes tell artists. I always feel like, it's not like, because, I mean, to get better, you have to get used to kind of being rejected, I think, at times. And I like to get positive feedback, and sometimes.
But it can be hard when the subject is really personal.
Right, and there's limited slots. So I feel like it has to be at a certain level that I just believe, and it's not like this is just my opinion on it. I mean, it's not like there's other places you can submit, especially online. And so, but I certainly have always but you're welcome to keep submitting and stuff if I feel like you're, I think part of it is continuing to improve as an artist and trying things that maybe they don't work. But as far as, I guess I have an innate sensibility about what I consider to be, and it's pretty broad too, because I really love comics, the whole medium and stuff, so I'm pretty much aware of the different types and styles and stuff. So, so I feel like I am more open to something that maybe someone wouldn't consider to be traditional, because I'm aware that, if it works for me, and I feel like if it's really giving viewers something kind of new and unique. Like there was a really great strip that ran for a while by this artist, Kate LaCour, that it was a half-page strip, and it really wasn't a comic, but it was like, eventually they got published in a really great book called Vivisectionary by Fantagraphics. They were more like, imagine a book of science of strange anatomies and cutaway views, and it was usually some, dealt with like body morphic issues, but really combining animal stuff. So it seemed almost like a weird science textbook, but it was really also sort of dreamlike in the way that she combined these forms. So there was nothing funny about it. It's just that each one she did was very intriguing, that made you think about how these things related, and it was a really incredible. And then unfortunately, it was done in full color, but Antigravity's black and white. But we were able to do grayscale, so at least you get a little bit of her gray wash came out in it. But that was the one where the minute I saw it, I was like, that's extraordinary. And I'd seen a few of them, and she liked them, and the fact that she considered doing it, I feel a little bit of pride that, having a deadline each month made her do more to where eventually she had a body of work that could be published in this really great book. So, you know.
And Chelsey, I'm kind of carrying on this idea of wearing an editor hat, having a conversation about conveying messages. Have you seen, I mean, obviously it differs from like the process you had making this book, but how do you help, what kind of projects are you working on? How do you help people kind of get their message clear?
Yeah, I guess at the beginning of my editorship, it was a lot more like passing the manuscript back and forth, and I'd give my feedback, pass it back to the author, they'd make the changes they want, pass it back to me. And there wasn't usually too much discussion between us, especially because many of our authors aren't local, so email seemed intuitive enough, especially pre-Zoom. But lately, I'm in a more like collaborative process on some books that I'm working on, including a craft book that I'm really excited about, as well as a collection of West African myth and folklore. And I found that like working and meeting with the authors more like as the manuscript accrues, instead of like working with the near complete manuscript and kind of passing it, it's a lot richer, and it helps from what they say, them fine-tune what their message is, and you know, having more questions folded into their process brings out more richness and more precision, and also opens up more possibilities. And I find that it engages me more too. It feels almost less like homework and more like co-creation, which I think is the ideal of editorship.
We talked a little bit about the intentional kind of gaps, and not gaps, but the black and white artwork for Trinity City, and how it's kind of inviting readers to fill in the blanks. With Monumental, we decided to go full color. We kind of went with this impressionistic style of art, almost like you're kind of looking into a lens into the past. We also had a lot of visual, we had like a database of historical references for the artists, so that our images could be accurate, because we're a museum and it's nonfiction and we want to be meticulous about it. But, you know, and you were talking, Ceasar, about, you know, the paper, the limitations of the format being black and white. Sometimes you kind of have to, you lose a little bit of the creative choice of the artist. With the zine, I'm sure you had a lot of creative control over it. So I'm curious about like your cover choice, the images that you chose to put in there. Like, how did that all help you convey the messages that you wanted? And were there any limitations that you had in putting this object together?
Yeah, I guess my visual side is definitely weaker, so it was all kind of instinctive choices. Mm-hmm. And with the cover, I wanted to center the object that I did end up choosing to leave behind from the things that I was bringing down from Cincinnati, which was, there was a Bible that belonged to my father's father that was then his, and there were yellow roses pressed in there from my grandfather's funeral. So I took one of the roses and left that in one of the bayous in the Delta area. So I wanted to feature that on the cover. And then I also, at one point, I had to call somebody to get directions to one of the museums, and I wrote that down by hand, which, because my signal was too weak to GPS, which felt both out of time and also just like familiar in a different way. So that is the handwriting on the back and front here. And it felt good to incorporate that physicality too, and you know, what happened with my hand. But other than that, the images, I mean, there are some images I included that I took on the trip, and also some historical ones that illustrated, you know, the points that I wanted to make. It was also exciting. I wasn't sure at first whether I get to use this glittery gold paper for the cover, which felt really important. And I also included an image of Emmett and his mother in the back, and I just love the way that is on the gold. So yeah, I think even though the book isn't as visual as even some of the other zines I've done, I tried to select those images carefully. Yeah.
I really like those choices. I mean, I love just hearing the story, you know, I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations and how many little sketches we've had. I don't even know if we ended up with the best image, but just to figure out what to put on the cover or something, you know. So ultimately we chose here we wanted to convey, because nowhere here does it say he was the first black governor in U.S. history, so he's taking the oath of office, statuesque, but I mean, we had about a dozen different versions of this to end up in that place. So I just love hearing other people's processes, and it's beautiful. You're a little bit younger, and so I'm curious, having gone through this process and maybe having listened to some of us here, what are some of your aspirations, creatively, or has the work on Trinity City Comics changed, like the course you're on, or given you any, threads to follow career-wise or just creative-wise? I'm just curious.
I will say that when I got the email asking me, I freaked out because it was like a bucket list moment, because I love comic books, and I was like, oh my god, I get to work on one, and I was like, and I'm not much, and I wrote this in like when I was like thinking over what I would talk about. I'm like a performance artist, and that's like definitely my thing. I love visual arts, and I do it all the time, but I wouldn't say I'm like the greatest at it. It's definitely not my focus. So I'm like, I don't know, like when I was younger, I had like an idea for a comic, and I would draw it, and I liked it, and I lost it, I don't know where it is. But it's all in there, it's on my heart. But I was like, this would be like something that's like really cool to do. And the fact that I got to be on like the creative, or the process in general, just like, I was like, all right, I love this. Even if I can't draw my own thing, that I'm like at least like helping, like, and the fact that I actually really like believe in what it's discussing and showing, that it's great. I did write this, and I really liked it. Like I said, I'm a performance artist, I do theater, so usually I read the lines that other people write for me, and I don't come up with stuff on the top of my head, so I did write what I wanted to say. But I was saying that this process has been like an incredible journey to witness and be a part of, and like every time like I saw an aspect of it, I was just so blown away. I was like, okay, I realized that like life is art. So like there are emails that need responses, there are Zooms that need to be met in, and there's a timeline, there are deadlines that we talked about, and there's organization, and that's really like nice to see in a professional setting, see like how that's done, especially in a professional setting and in an artistic setting, seeing how they collide, and then also heart and soul and dedication and unity and collaboration, and then there's creation and execution and then creation again. So the stories that I've heard in the meetings and the Zoom meetings and sitting around a dinner table in Mr. Matt's garden with people that I've met like on this journey alone, and listening to them share, like the writers will be like, oh, I sprinkled this in the, when I was sending you my draft, and then the illustrator would be like, yeah, I know, I picked up on it. Like just seeing the intuition that they have, the collaboration that they have, they really become, I wouldn't say like one, but they become a unit. And just seeing like, the fact that they, I don't know, like some of us have known each other throughout like many different experiences, and some of us are meeting for the first time, and the fact that we're like, I was like, when I was reading, I was like, that really affected me. I didn't even know what that like illustration was paired to, but I was like, I saw the picture and I was like, okay, I just got emotional for a second. I'm in the backseat of a car right now. I'm having lunch on my way to a meeting. This is it. But just seeing how like art itself stimulates your senses and connects in different ways. I've like gotten to feel the process do the exact same.
Well, you said something interesting to me about, and what I want to chat a little bit longer and then leave about 10 minutes for questions in case anybody wants to talk to any of our panelists about anything, but just bringing people from different perspectives. So, like for example, with Monumental, you know, I'm a writer and editor, and so I was working with Brian Mitchell, the author, on the script, and a momentous scene is Oscar Dunn's funeral, which at the time was reported to be the largest funeral in the funeral procession in the history of the city. There's not a lot of words in that section, so when we're working on the script, you know, I said, okay, this might be 2 or 4 pages. And when the illustrator got it in his hands, he said, you know, you really need to let this breathe. You know, I want to see all the different individuals who are represented in the parade. We can have pages without text, you know, and that ends up being one of the most effective sections of the book, and it was because the illustrator, whose job is not really the script or the writing, but understands the flow and the way people are going to process the images, to say, hey, let's. I think it ends up being 8 or 10 pages, and a lot of it is just dramatic, and you get different perspectives of Canal Street as they're coming down, and the way the buildings looked, and the looks on people's faces, and so you don't get that operating in a silo, you know, as a creator, and it really helps to have those other perspectives. So the topic is social justice, and so that is, you know, we create art, we create comics and stories for different purposes. Sometimes it's for entertainment and superheroes, inspiration, but a lot of what we're talking about today is purpose-driven, creative work, stuff that we want to have an impact. And, you know, I'd be curious to hear from all of you about impacts that you've seen from work, or what you hope you can inspire from this work. Something that I've learned from Monumental is that once you make something like that, or like this, or like Trinity, or you put out, you know, a year's worth of magazines, is you've made this thing, but now what? You know, like, you've created this thing, but you still, that's kind of the starting point. You know, with Monumental, we didn't make a book because we wanted to be a bestseller or win awards or whatever. We wanted to have a ripple effect in the world around us, you know. So one thing I've been really excited about is, like, it's being taught in schools, it's in curricula in middle schools and high schools in Louisiana and other states. We've been able to influence the street renaming process. So like right now they've taken the cannons out of Washington Artillery Square in the French Quarter, and the process has begun to figure out how to commemorate Oscar Dunn in that space in the French Quarter. And Brian and I have been involved in that process. So like, but none of that happens if we don't continue to put effort into spreading the story after the book has been created, and basically using it as like a proof of concept, sort of. So I'm curious, like, imagined impacts, hoped impacts, like when you guys create, and sometimes like it's a really personal thing. So maybe it's just, I need to get this out into the world, and however people receive it is great. But, you know, when we talk about social justice through media, it's static until people have a response, until action takes place once it's out there. So I'll open up to anybody who has thoughts on that.
I guess I'm thinking in terms of like why I've done it, or what led me to do it, and how anything I do, that it ripples out in a way that I hopefully think is a positive one. I know for me that I'm sort of classic latchkey kid in the 70s, where I grew up with my mom, who was working a lot of the time as a nurse, and my younger brother, but in the time where she wasn't there to parent, drawing and being creative and sort of comics and stuff became something that was a really self-affirming and grounding thing that I feel very thankful that I've had my whole life. That really wasn't about the success of it. It was like when I sit down and I'm focused on this, like any other creative medium, but I mean comics and stuff, is that, you know, it was like giving yourself strokes in a way that made you have a sense of purpose, or sense of you're this person here. And I feel like we live in a world where there's so much going on, and division and marginalization that happens, that it was an activity that I knew. So I know whatever I create as an example of in this medium, because I do think the thing is, it is such an easily accessible medium to whatever financial tier. It's just that I think there has to be more examples to where younger people see them, are exposed to them to where they can see themselves starting to do that. And once they've done that, I think it leads to a process as they grow older that I think they'll meet kindred spirits who are also doing comics and stuff. Who also, it's like you'll have the same sort of things that you'll just know, you won't have to talk about it, but you'll have things in common. And through that, I think, is where I just feel like discussion and conversation, the vision that's today is like you need to have people engaging in conversations, and a lot of times about difficult subjects and stuff, and I feel like that's where having that background is the beginning of being able to have those discussions. And you both have this safe ground of this passion for this medium or knowledge of a certain thing that will allow it to get more complex and allow it to get more possibly difficult when you get into the thornier issues about social justice and stuff. But I think that's where it's really useful, and I feel like, I guess, and it's like any creative medium, I feel like in a world where there's so much destruction, and I'm someone who's different, where I've never had set characters. It's always been about the medium. Like, I have tons of different characters. It's always been about the joke in the strip, because I feel like too often there's way too much over-consumerism of characters that get popular. And while they're popular, they make and print all these things that when they get unpopular, you've got tons of shirts and stuff that just ends up in landfills and stuff, as opposed to the actual ideas that are in the comics themselves. So that's just for me, I feel like. So I feel like when you're just dealing with the medium itself and not dealing with the consumerism of that, I feel like that's a healthier place to be, because it's a separate thing to deal with consumerism. It's more of like realizing it's really about people discussing how they feel about where they are, how they relate to each other, in the community they're in, and finding solutions when there are frictions, when there are misunderstandings, that are not understanding the perspective of someone else. And I feel like that's what's so, and it's, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, is that it's additive. It's not about the great success of something. Even someone making a small zine, I personally feel like makes the world a better place. It's additive, it's not destructive. Whether or not someone relates to it, it still feels like I'd rather live in a world where there's people producing this small bit of their perspective of being a human being in this world and what's coming out of their life experience. I'm glad. I just think the idea that, it offsets the brutal nature of so much of, and now we live in a time when mass media is constantly hitting us with the destruction and division. That for me, the personal, the intimacy of someone creating something, if you make that connection, it makes me feel good. It makes me feel like, oh, there's someone else that I feel similar to, or that opinion they're espousing is like, yeah, it makes me feel like I'm not alone. And it's not like this big thing. It's like, wow, I feel really great that person said that. I can totally relate with it. I feel like that's the thing that I like. As those experiences ripple out, I feel like, it feels like I'm not alone. The world is this beautiful thing, but too often we've got this other stuff we have to get through with. So, I don't know, it's kind of rambling, but...
No, I mean, it's that connection, right? And that's such a big part of it. Chelsey,
Yeah, the question hits home because the hats of the writer and the editor are quite different from the hat of the marketer, the distributor, the self-promoter, and I'm struggling with that, frankly, like I am. But what I hope is that, yes, if people read my piece, they would be inspired to take seriously their own position as witnesses in and agents of history, whether that's collective history, family history, personal history, in a place, and just take seriously their own perspective, and also know that there's richness to be found by digging into their sore spots, or the snags of their identity, the snags of their story. That's something I did try to do throughout this, and it was hard and it was challenging, but I think it led me to greater clarity, and I think that's something we all need to keep doing. There will always be more snags, and if we can actually talk about those snags, maybe yes, we won't feel so isolated.
For Trinity, the main goal to go from here is discussion and youth engagement, which is just kind of the mission statement from the beginning. But as Whitney Houston once said, I believe the children are the future. So, you know, we're gonna have these workshops, and we're gonna adapt and then create the story going from there. What the teens have to say about what, like, you were asking me earlier, what I hope to see and what I hope to see is the brilliant brain children of the teens that we meet and that share their thoughts.
The ripple effects, right?
Yeah.
The seeds being planted. Yeah.
Exactly, and like I was saying earlier, like when you can like point to something and be like, hey, like that's my influence. I did that, even with the like coloring in the illustrations yourself. I feel like it'll keep going, like you said, ripple effect with like, hey, I discussed that and someone actually listened to me, and this is something that I have a genuine concern over and something that I really want to see. This is kind of like a liaison for like getting your voice out there.
I like that. Well, let's see. We have about 5-6 minutes. But if anybody has any questions, hi Tana. By the way, Tana Coleman is in the audience. She was the designer of this book. She's an amazing designer. I gotta give you a shout out. So thank you all. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. And yeah, open to questions if you have any. Right back here.
I'm wondering, I do think both Zines, and although one can read comics online, I really hate reading comics I mean, except for webcomics, which are kind of way. Like, all y'all are kind of working in a pretty physical medium, and I wonder, is that, like, especially with the landscape and publishing and media consumption changing to a lot of more online platforms, like how intentional that choice feels and what benefits you think physicality has, or that it is even important to you. With your work.
I'll answer. If I'm correct, I remember we discussed having physical and online accessibility to the comics. So, and I think that was very intentional, considering like our main demographic is teenagers, and like I said, I love comics, and I remember a couple years ago I went to like the comic store that was nearby, and then I found out like a little bit later that it was like closing. So that was like the last time that I could go there. So I know I picked up comics like at the library, or like if the bookstores are doing like some like promotion or something, and then I think the Flash is like one of my favorite superheroes, or like he's my favorite superhero. So I got like that as like a Christmas gift, was like a compilation of the comics. So where I read zines, and I read comics mostly online anyway, because it's just because of COVID, I wasn't able to go anywhere, and then just being a teenager, and then also I kind of have like this like demand. I'm like, I want to read it now. If I can binge something right now, and I can listen to any song I want right now, I want to read what I want right now. And also I always get the urge to read something at like 4 in the morning and it's something I'm like, oh, I just heard about this and I want to read it right now, and everyone's asleep and every store is closed. So I just think maybe it's like, it's very much so generational that like people age. I think there's definitely something with physicality, but I think it's just like part of, it's like ingrained into us.
I guess when we're talking about accessibility, and that makes sense, is that the ultimate accessibility to look at something and for
Or to be able to afford it, even. Yeah.
And unfortunately, due to the pandemic, I mean, had been for a good while every year, there was a few shows that were dedicated to zines and comics that you could go and people could set up tables and you could actually share and sell. And you were able to, people specifically, if they weren't necessarily had shifted to more digital, if they knew that show was coming up, they would make something particular for that show, which I sort of was a reason that there might be a chance or a place where they might sell. Whereas normally most people are selling through Instagram accounts now, I guess, or something. But there's still lots of people that are still self-publishing their own work. It's just that it used to think it'd be a little easier to find like I don't know, not a database, but something where there was a sampling of a bunch of, and that's where these shows, there really hasn't been one since before the pandemic. There actually is, the New Orleans Book Fair is coming up again at the library on December 10th, which is kind of a return to where the people are setting up and selling zines and books and comics and stuff. Yeah. So, which is great, because I feel that's also a place for people. There's a lot of cross-pollination between, again, building, where you're encountering other artists and stuff, and then I think that's where, again, going back to having conversations and meeting new artists and stuff. And there's actually someone sitting, and I'm just talking about old zines, a gentleman, Abram Himmelstein, did an amazing zine back in the day, which actually became a book, and it was a simple concept. He went around with t-shirts and markers and asked people to write what they wanted to say on the t-shirt, whatever that was, and would photograph it. So it was a zine that was really, I thought it was amazing, because you really got a cross-selection of all these, it was people all over New Orleans. So. And it's still out there, I think. There's probably copies you can still get your hands on and stuff. But that was a simple concept zine that I thought was really brilliant, that really gave you a cross-selection of just all these different, people's perspectives.
That's great. Do we have any other questions? I know we're running short on time, but I want to give people a chance if they want to pick any more brains. If not, we're right on time. And I have carpool to get to. But hrilina and Chelsey, Ceasar, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been great.